Shalom, and welcome to V'ahavta Yisrael, a Hebrew phrase which means you shall love Israel. We hope you'll stay with us for the next 30 minutes as our teacher, Dr. Baruch, shares his expository teaching from the Bible. Dr. Baruch is the senior lecturer at the Zera Avraham Institute based in Israel. Although all courses are taught in Hebrew at the Institute, Dr. Baruch is pleased to share this weekly address in English. To find out more about our work in Israel, please visit us on the web at LoveIsrael.org. That's one word, LoveIsrael.org. Now, here's Baruch with today's lesson.
Many times, what is important to a person is being right. And this overshadows what should be important to us, and that is building up one another, lifting them up, helping them mature and grow in the faith, that they may be strong, that they might be edified in the things of God. Again, all too often we do not think about the spiritual condition of someone else. We're just wanting to be right, and that is highly unfortunate. And this is the issue that Paul's going to deal with in today's study. So with that said, take out your Bible and look with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. The book of 1 Corinthians and chapter 8. Now, we're going to see that the underwriting example that Paul is using is food, which is sacrificed to idols, and what should be one's response to it. And what may be surprising is that Paul says your response should be done in light of the spiritual condition of those around you. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, let's look at the text. And we need to go through this slowly, and we also need to point out that in this text, we're going to see how Paul builds and reveals the points that he wants to make for the overall purpose, and that is edifying someone and not being a stumbling block in their spiritual growth. So look with me to verse 1. We read here, and concerning that which is sacrificed to idols. So we're speaking here of offerings that are made to a pagan image, as recorded here, an idol. So that's the subject, but he's using that to teach us an overriding spiritual concern, a principle that we should have. And once again, that is the growth and the maturity of one another, that they might know the truth and be set free from any wrong view. Not that we use our liberty and our knowledge and we build ourselves up while stepping over other individuals. So he says, and concerning those things that are sacrificed to idols, he says, we know that we all have knowledge. And that's the accurate way to translate this. He says, among ourselves, we all know that we have knowledge. But knowledge is not enough. Just knowing even what is right is not the deciding factor. We need to be able to share that in love, recognizing the spiritual condition, sometimes the immaturity, and not overwhelming people with the liberty of the truth. So he says here, yes, we know that we all have knowledge, but here's the danger. Notice what he says. The knowledge puffs up. And this speaks about, it's similar to if we think about Passover and chametz. It's talking about those things that are forbidden, those things that are puffed up, those things that rise. And oftentimes we have an image here of sinfulness, that it begins very small, but it grows and it overtakes many aspects of our life. So he's warning and says, be careful, because this knowledge that you may have, that I may have, it may actually be a source of pride. It may puff you up rather than what should be the foundational guiding principle in our life. And what is that? Love. He says, but love edifies. And that is a word. It is a word of construction. It is a word for building up. So we have two things going on. Knowledge leads to pride, but love leads to being a source of edification for others. So he's going to emphasize us approaching this issue, not just this one, but many spiritual issues, and doing so with love, that is, putting our thoughts off ourselves and upon someone else and their growth, their maturity, building them up for the purposes of God. Look now to verse 2. He says, but if a certain one thinks to know, that means if there's someone and he thinks that he knows. And the implication is that he thinks he knows a lot. What does it say? Not yet, nothing he knows as it's necessary to know. So what the scripture, and I translated very literally, it says, if someone thinks that he knows something, well, in actuality, what he knows is not yet to the extent as he needs to know. Why? The implication is he thinks knowledge makes right. And knowledge is the trump card which overshoots everything. That is, dominates everything. If you know it, then that's where the power is. But this is not what we see biblically. Knowledge is important, but it needs to be demonstrated with love. So once more, look at verse 2. But if someone thinks he knows something, but not yet knows nothing as he needs to know. He goes back, look at verse 3. But if a certain one loves God, this one is known by him. There's the key. Knowing something doesn't bring God's blessings into your life. But rather, when we love God, we are known by him. Here's the important thing. Not just what we can know, but that God knows us. And this word know implies a active and experiential presence and God intimately involved in someone's life. So loving God is where it begins. Because it's through loving God that I can do what? Love my neighbor as myself. So it's not saying that knowledge is bad, that knowledge should just be set aside, it's not of value. He's not saying that. But knowledge, apart from love, is not going to have an edifying influence in a situation. Move on to the next verse, verse 4. He says, concerning the food, therefore, which is sacrificed to idols. Now, what he's doing here is giving an example of someone that has knowledge in regard to this issue, but his knowledge is not ministering and demonstrating love for that other person. Rather, this knowledge that he's utilizing is actually destroying a fellow believer. So that's where we're going, but it's very important that we pay attention to how we get there and what is being revealed in the text. So once more, verse 4. Concerning of food, therefore, that is sacrificed to idols. That's the subject. Now realize, there was idols, go back to that time, and not just that time. You can go to many places in the world, especially in Asia, and you see all these pagan shrines. And you go, walk through a city, and you see these edifices of worship, pagan worship. And we've walked down the streets and we've seen people bringing offerings, usually fruits and vegetables, but in this day also meat as well. And this is going to be at the heart of what Paul is going to be speaking of. And he says, concerning the food, therefore, that is sacrificed to idols, we know that nothing is idols in the world. Now, this is important because we have some idol, and people might revere it. They may pay homage to it. They may make offerings to it. So what? In actuality, all that is wood or metal or stone or something along those lines that are made into an image. It is nothing. It has no spiritual power whatsoever. And we need not be afraid of those things or give them any relevance in our life. Now let me give you an example. We have some friends, and they were given this little statue. And they looked at it, and they didn't think anything to it. It was just a statue that some friends brought to them from a faraway place. And they put it in their home and never gave any thought about it. And then what happens? Some other friends come by and say, you know, that is an idol. That is part of some other worship. And you should get rid of that. And what happens? Well, these people, they are bothered by that. And they begin to think, and they begin to conjure up, you know, it was after that idol came into our house that you lost your job. And we had that car accident and this, and they put all this power of bad things happening from that idol. That is ridiculous. The truth should never cause one to arrive at such a false conclusion. And what did they do? Well, they threw it out, and they believed that solved their problems. Well, in my opinion, that statue had no influence whatsoever. All it is rock or metal or stone of no power whatsoever. But I'm not saying it's a good testimony to have one of those in your home. But here's what Paul is pointing out. He says here, look at this. We know, and he's talking about strong believers, that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other God except one. Now, it's significant because when Paul is speaking to believers, and the implication is mature believers, he says God is what? God is one. And there's no other gods at all in the world. Now, he goes on and says something. That's a fact. But all of these people call things God and idols and such. Why do I say that? Well, notice verse 5. For also indeed there are those that are called God, whether they be in heaven or whether they be on earth, with the result, because people call these things God, that there are many gods and many masters, many lords. Now, this is from a jargon standpoint, what people say. So you go to some countries, and they have thousands of gods that are worshipped and revered. So there are other gods, other lords and such, by name, being called that. But remember what he said earlier. In actuality, we know there are no other gods, only one God. And obviously he's speaking about the God of Israel. Now, verse 6. But to us, one God, the Father, from whom all things, and we are in him. How are we in him? Through a covenant, through Messiah. And one Lord, Messiah Yeshua, through whom all things, and the implication is that it was Messiah who made all things, that he is the creator, not God the Father, but God the Son. And we through him. So we exist, and we are alive spiritually by means of Messiah. Through him, this all came about. But not all are in this knowledge. Not all are in this way of thinking. But there are certain ones, read on in verse 7, but there are certain ones of a conscience or habit. Now, if you look at the Textus Receptus, what I'm reading, we have the word conscience. It is pronounced sunedise. But the Nestle Aland, it has a different word, sunetheia. Sunetheia is a habit. So it's talking about individuals that have a habit or a custom that was taught to them, that's embraced. But we know something. We know the truth. But there are still others who are in a type of bondage to their tradition, what they've been taught. And what the Textus Receptus says is that this has been ingrained in their conscience. They really believe it because of their traditions, how they were raised. So there are certain ones of the conscience of idols until now, as eating those things sacrificed to idols, they still see them as having significance, eating the things that are sacrificed to idols. And because of that, it says, and their conscience being weak are what? Are contaminated or rendered unclean. Now, this is what he's saying. There are some, and the implication is believers, and they still believe that these idols have some spiritual authority, some spiritual power. And therefore, they also believe that if someone, here's the implication, someone comes and offers a fruit offering, it's food, but fruit to this idol. And then that fruit makes its way into the market, and we buy it as a believer, and we eat it. Now, a mature believer knows that because it was offered up by some religious service, it has having nothing to do with any spiritual implications to that. It's not as though demons attach themselves to these idols, in the sense that if now we might go to someone's home and they serve this fruit, that it's going to affect us spiritually. Paul's saying that's not going to happen. But there are those who are weak in the conscience, and they still believe that these idols have some spiritual ramification, some implication. And therefore, they can have their conscience made impure by witnessing things. And we'll talk about what he's talking about in a moment. Look at verse 8. But food, we do not commend ourselves to God. What he's talking about here, and he's going to state this, but let me say it first and then we'll read the text. It is not by food that we commend ourselves. Literally, that word for commending is a word paraistemai. What is that? To stand near. So we don't grow closer to God by what we eat or what we don't eat in regard to those things sacrificed to idols or not. So food is not a cause for drawing us near or far away from God. Now realize the context. This is in regard to food which was sacrificed to idols. Don't bring other issues related to the dietary laws into this text. Paul's not doing that. So this text has nothing to do with kashrut, or the dietary laws, what's oftentimes referred to as kosher. No, he's talking about one specific issue, and here again, the purpose of that issue is to illustrate an overriding principle that should govern all of our decisions. And what's that? Not base everything in knowledge makes right, but be people who walk in love, who want to build up others. And the emphasis here is that we're going to be dealing with someone who is a weak brother. That is, their conscience has been trained to believe that these idols have some type of spiritual authority. There's ramifications spiritually to one's well-being. Therefore, by their habit, through their conscience, however your Bible translates it, when they witness someone eating of these food that are sacrificed to idols, it has a negative effect upon them. They think this is wrong and that it's sinful. So he says here, because of the condition of some's conscience in regard to idols, until this very time, having to do with food sacrificed to idols, them eating, and also their conscience being weak, is what is damaged, we could say. It is contaminated. So when they witness, and the context is other believers who are knowledgeable and know that these vegetables, these fruits and such, just because they were once offered up to idols, but now they make their way into the market and they're being sold, they don't have any effect in that food whatsoever, whether we eat it or whether we don't. What does he say? Notice verse 8. But by food we do not commend ourselves to God. For whether we eat, he says it doesn't make us better. And if we don't eat, it doesn't make us less. So he says here, if we are strong and we say, I can eat that, let me have that, it doesn't have any power, it doesn't make us more pleasing to God, more acceptable to God. Likewise, those who say, no, I'm going to refrain from that, it doesn't make us less before God. This is not what it's about. He goes on to another issue. Look now to verse 9. This is when he gets into the seriousness of the principle. He says, but look out. That is the word watch. Now, it's an important word in the New Covenant. It's used always in regard to significant matters. For example, this is what Yeshua told the disciples to do on the night that he was betrayed. When he was arrested, he says, watch with me in the garden. That is, pray. He also tells us in the last days to be watching. It's that same word. So he says, but you be watching lest this authority of yours does something, that it becomes a stumbling block for those who are weak. So he says, watch out, take heed, pay attention. All of those are contained in that word that simply is, you watch out. That you, notice what he says, look carefully at it, that you do not, having this authority, that you do not allow to become a stumbling block to those that are weak. Verse 10. For if a certain one sees you, who's you? The one having knowledge. What knowledge? That there is nothing to these idols. And therefore, because food was brought before them, and a prayer was made, some religious ceremony took place, and now that food is taken to the marketplace to be sold, that has no spiritual implication whatsoever. And those that are mature, they have, and this is who he's speaking about, he says, but if a certain one sees you, the one having knowledge, it says, in regard to that you are in a pagan shrine, a pagan temple, reclining. Now, the implication is reclining to eat. Now, he's giving a situation. He says, if you have knowledge and you are even seen in a shrine, what is that shrine? It's just a building. Doesn't matter what other people might think about it. There's nothing going on there of any spiritual consequences whatsoever. It is only in people's mind, it's a figment of their imagination. These idols, these holy things that the world sees, they are nothing. As God says, there are wood and stone and metal and gold and things along those lines. Nothing more. They're just homri, they're just materialistic. So he says, if someone should see you, the one having knowledge, in a pagan shrine, reclining, that is probably reference to eating. It says here, will his conscience of the one being weak be built up? Will he be encouraged then to eat those things sacrificed to idols? Now here's the key. He thinks that there's something to this. He's weak. He doesn't understand they're nothing. So he thinks that there is something to these food which has been offered up to idols. But he sees you having knowledge, eating those things. What is he going to do? He is going to be emboldened to eat them as well, but not from the point of knowledge. He's going to do it because he is going to want to do these things. Why? We all have that rebellious nature. So he's not going to eat from the perspective of knowledge. No, he's going to do so from a position of immaturity. And what's the outcome about it? Notice what it says. Look again. He says, this one, will he be emboldened? He'll be built up, not in the right way, but in order to eat the things offered up, sacrificed to idols. And what happens? Look at verse 11. Because he is weak, he is confused, what happens? It says, and this one perishes. He is destroyed. Now, it's not talking about salvation. It's talking about his spiritual condition. It is going to be in an adverse condition. This one who is your weak brother. And why is he going to be perishing? Why is he going to be moving away from the truth? It is because, notice what he says, because of your knowledge. So this one is going to be in a poor state on account of this one, on account of whom Messiah died. So Messiah died for this one, and instead of you edifying him in the right way, you are encouraging him, emboldening him to do what he believes is wrong to do. That's the point. And in doing so, what are you? Well, here's the key. Instead of edifying, building up, you are a stumbling block. And this is what he's going to emphasize in the last part of this chapter. So one who is weak, who thinks something is wrong, he ought not do it, because it's going to have an adverse spiritual effect in him, because he thinks he is being disobedient. And because he thinks he's being disobedient and acting upon that, it is going to push him away from intimacy with God. He's going to feel guilty. He's going to feel shame. He's going to feel unworthy. And it's going to have an adverse effect upon him spiritually. So he says here very clearly, upon your knowledge, you are having this adverse effect upon the one through whom Messiah died. Look now to verse 12. But thus you are sinning against your brother, and you are injuring his weak conscience. So even though we may be doing the right thing in the sense we have knowledge, and we're acting on that knowledge, these vegetables, these things, these foods sacrificed to idols, they have no power whatsoever. Our conscience is clean. We have liberty, no problem. But when we exercise that liberty publicly, it can have an adverse effect on the one that Messiah has died for. Verse 12. And thus you are sinning against the brothers and injuring their weak conscience. For against Messiah you are sinning. Why? Because you're not walking in love. You're walking in your own desire based upon knowledge, but without being a good steward of that knowledge, utilizing it for the spiritual edification of someone else. That's what he's warning. So look again. He says, you are sinning against the brothers, and you are injuring their weak conscience, and against Messiah you are sinning. Therefore, last verse, verse 13, he says, therefore, if food, he says, is a stumbling block for my brother, he says, no, I will not eat meat ever. So he's saying here, if it's a matter of being a stumbling block for my brother, no, we can translate that, will never, he says, eat meat. Now, before we wrap up, meat is a unique instance. Why? Well, primarily, fruits and vegetables are acceptable before God. We know that looking at the Torah, there are certain types of meat, certain animals that are forbidden. Now, of course, Paul's not dealing with that issue. But realize something. Normally, when an animal was sacrificed, remember what he says, this is James, to Paul in Acts 15, that we need to stay away from idols, we need to stay away from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. Now, blood is an important aspect. And what I need to share with you is this. History tells us that they would remove the blood from the animal. It was dealt with differently, separately. And that is why some have said that this pagan process, because blood was removed, and it all depends upon how the animal was killed. If it was killed by bleeding it, by slaughter, it might be acceptable. But Paul says, nevertheless, whether that's the case or not the case, he says, and he chooses meat because this is the controversial issue. When we're just dealing with offerings to idols, we may be dealing with vegetables and fruits and finances, money. But when we get to meat, there's much more of a doubt involved. And Paul, knowing that, says something. He's not going to worry about the rightness or the wrongness. Is it permissible or not? This is what he says. He says, in regard for my brother's well-being, look at verse 13. He says, therefore, if scandalize, and that's what the word is in Greek, but it's word, if food is an offense to my brother, I will not eat meat forever, in order that my brother should not stumble. So Paul is not using his freedom and liberty in a way that only is focused upon self and ignores someone else. No, the liberty and the freedom that we have should always be mediated out in light of a testimony to others. And what is the foundational principle? What he said twice, and that is love. Love of God, but also that love of God is going to move us to also love our neighbor as ourselves and not want to injure them spiritually, damage their conscience, confuse them, or motivate them to do what they feel is rebellious, because then they're going to be feeling ashamed and guilt that they have defiled themselves, whether this is a fact or not. Remember what the scripture says. To him who thinks it's sin and does it, it's sin. Because we should not have the motivation. I think this is wrong to do, and I do it. Even if it's right, but I think it's wrong and I do it, I'm acting in rebellion. If I think it's wrong, I shouldn't do it. So this is what Paul is saying, that we need to be concerned about the spiritual edification, the building up of one another. And he uses this issue of food sacrificed to idols or offered up to idols as a way of giving us a proof text for understanding the issue. Well, I'll end with that until next week, and we enter into 1 Corinthians and chapter 9. Shalom from Israel.
Well, we hope you will benefit from today's message and share it with others. Please plan to join us each week at this time and on this channel for our broadcast of LoveIsrael.org. Again, to find out more about us, please visit our website, LoveIsrael.org. There you will find articles and numerous other lectures by Baruch. These teachings are in video form. You may download them or watch them in streaming video. Until next week, may the Lord bless you in our Messiah Yeshua, that is, Jesus, as you walk with Him. Shalom from Israel.